In this lecture, we will understand special program number 7, Pascal's triangle. So without any further delay, let's get started. The topic of this presentation is special program, print the Pascal's triangle. In this lecture, we will understand how to print the Pascal's triangle on the screen. So now let's look at the problem statement first. Write a program to print the Pascal's triangle as shown. Our job is to print this Pascal's triangle on the screen. This is just an example. Our program should be flexible enough to print any size Pascal's triangle. Here in this Pascal's triangle, we have a total of 5 rows. But we may want to print Pascal's triangle of maybe 20 rows, maybe 50 rows. It can be any size Pascal's triangle. So we need to write the program keeping this thing in mind. Now, let's understand how we can print any size Pascal's triangle on the screen. For this, we need to understand the pattern behind Pascal's triangle. This is the Pascal's triangle, and in each row of Pascal's triangle, we can observe that the first value and the last value is always 1. Here we can observe that the first value and the last value in each row is always 1. But what about these middle values? How do we calculate these values? We can easily calculate these values because there is one pattern which is following here. In order to obtain this value, we need to add these two values. 1 plus 1 gives us 2. Similarly, if we want to obtain this value, then we need to add these two values. 1 plus 2 gives us 3. Here 2 plus 1 gives us 3. That is why we have 3 and 3 over here. Because 1 plus 2 is 3 and 2 plus 1 is also 3. What about this value? 1 plus 3 is 4. How do we obtain this value? By adding these two values. 3 plus 3 gives us 6. What about this value 4? We'll get this value by adding these two values. 3 plus 1 is 4. In this way, we can obtain the rest of the values and we can print any size Pascal's triangle without any problem. I hope the pattern is completely clear. But now I would like to mention that this is not the only way to obtain these values. There are many ways to obtain these values, and one such way is to use the formula of NCR. Recall what is NCR from discrete mathematics. You might know already what is NCR. This formula allows us to select R objects from n distinct objects, and that too when order does not matter. We use that formula for this purpose. So NCR is used to select R objects from n distinct objects. This is how the formula looks like. NCR is equal to n factorial divided by R factorial into n minus R factorial. This is the formula of NCR, and we can obtain each value of this Pascal's triangle from this formula. How? Here we need to replace n by the row number and R by the column number. This is what we can do. Let us assume that this is the 0th row, this is the first row, this is the second row, this is the third row, and this is the 4th row. I have written row numbers here. And this value is at column number 0. Similarly, this value is also at column number 0 and this value is at column number 1. This value is at column number 0, this value is at column number 1 and this value is at column number 2. Similarly, we can obtain the column numbers for the rest of the values as well. Now your job is to replace these values by this formula. Let's replace these values by NCR. First, we will replace this value by NCR. Here n must be 0 and R must also be 0. So we can replace this value by 0C0. What is 0C0? If we put 0 in place of n and 0 in place of R, we will obtain 1 from this formula. And that's what we want. Similarly, here we can write 1C0 and here we can write 1C1. Both will return 1. Here we can write 2C0, here we can write 2C1 and here we can write 2C2. 2C0 and 2C2 will give us 1, but 2C1 will give us 2, and that's what we want. We can replace this value by 3C0, this value by 3C1, this value by 3C2, and this value by 3C3. We will obtain the respective values properly here. We can replace this value by 4C0, this value by 4C1, this value by 4C2, this value by 4C3, and this value by 4C4. In this way, we can obtain this Pascal's triangle and any size Pascal's triangle. Now, let's move ahead and write the program to print any size Pascal's triangle on the screen, that too with the help of this formula, that is n factorial divided by r factorial into n minus r factorial. The first thing that we need to do is to import a function from the math module. Now, what does it mean? We need to calculate the formula, that is NCR, which is equal to n factorial divided by r factorial into n minus r factorial. We can perform division and multiplication as usual. But what about the factorial? We need to calculate the factorial also. We do not have to write the code to calculate the factorial because Python provides us a function which we can directly use in our code without worrying about how it works. It does the job for us. We can use the function called factorial, which is available in the math module. You can think of a module as the collection of different functions. Math module is the collection of different mathematical functions. We can use that module to import what is called the factorial function. We need to type this instruction to import factorial function from the math module. From math, import factorial. This function we are importing from the math module. With this instruction, we are asking Python to import this function in this program. That's what we want. So this factorial function will be imported to this specific program, and now we are ready to use this factorial function in our program. Before using this function and before typing the formula, first we need to ask the user to enter the number of rows. And we are well familiar with this instruction already. We need to ask the user to enter the number of rows. We'll take that input, we'll provide that to int function, and eventually rows variable will point to that value. Now here, for the simplicity, we will assume that user will enter 5, and this means we eventually want to print this Pascal's triangle on the screen. Now, let's write the code to print this Pascal's triangle. We can observe this one thing, that this Pascal's triangle is a full pyramid. And we already know how to print full pyramid of stars, as we have already learned this in one of our presentations. But in place of stars, now we have values. We can replace star by the formula to calculate these values. That's not a problem. But one thing is clear, that we need to print full pyramid, and for that purpose we need nested for loop structure, and we need to take care of two things. First is that we need to take care of the white spaces that we need to print before printing the first value. In the 0th row, we need to print 4 white spaces first, and then we can print the first value. In the first row, we need to print 3 white spaces first, and then we can print the first value. In the second row, we first need to print 2 white spaces, and then we can proceed and print the first value. In this way, we can continue. The outer for statement looks like this. For n in range rows, this range function will return 0, 1, 2, 3 and 4 if rows variable is pointing to object with value 5. So here in this case, we will get 0, 1, 2, 3 and 4 because these are the row numbers we want. Here we know that eventually n will point to these values one at a time. N represents the row number. Now within this for statement, we need to write the inner for statement to handle the white spaces. This is how the inner for statement for white spaces looks like. For space in range 1, rows minus n. We are well familiar with this formula. We need to subtract row number from the number of rows. in order to obtain the number of white spaces that we need to print. So here we have for space in range 1, rows minus n. Initially we know that n will be 0. So here n will be replaced by 0. We know that rows is 5, so we'll get 5 here. From this range function, we will get 1, 2, 3 and 4. This means that this for loop will run 4 times, and that's what we want. Within this for statement, we need this print statement to print white spaces on the screen. Now after this for loop, we need this for statement to print the values on the screen for r in range n plus 1. Here we need to pass n plus 1 because we know that these values depends upon the row number in which they are. If we are at row number 0, then this range function will return just one value, that is 0. This means that n will be 0 and r will be 0, and that's what we want. The first value must be 0c0. Within this for statement, we will use the formula of NCR to calculate 0c0. We know that next time n will be 1, and in that case this range function will return two values, that is 0 and 1. These values represent the column numbers. Here r will receive first 0 and then 1, and that's what we want here. We want 1c0 first and then 1c1. So within this for statement, we first need to calculate the value of NCR. So NCR, this is the name of the variable, is equal to factorial n divided by factorial r into factorial n minus r. This is the same formula of NCR. We first need to calculate the factorial of n, then factorial of r, then factorial of n minus r, and eventually we need to perform these basic operations. After calculating NCR, we are ready to print the value on the screen. So we need this print statement. In this print statement, we can observe that first we need to print the value and then the white space. That's what we can observe here as well. Now we know that after completion of this for loop, we need to print new line. Now let's execute this code line by line, and let's see how do we obtain each value of the Pascal's triangle on the screen. First, let's execute this statement. Rows equal to int input enter the number of rows. With this, we know that we will get enter the number of rows on the screen. This means we are asking user to enter the number of rows. Let's say the user has entered 5. In that case, the rows variable will point to this object with value 5. Now after this, we need to execute this statement for n in range rows. This range function will return values 0, 1, 2, 3 and 4 because rows is 5. These values will be received by n one at a time. First, this n variable will receive value 0. This means that n is now pointing to this object with value 0. After this, we need to execute this statement for space in range 1, rows minus n. Here we need to replace rows by 5 and n by 0. We will get 5 here, which means that from this range function we will get 1, 2, 3 and 4. This means space variable will hold these values one at a time, and this means that this for statement will run a total of 4 times. Now we know that space variable is now pointing to this object with value 1. Now we need to execute this statement. This means that the first white space will be printed over here. After this, we need to execute this statement once again. This time space will receive value 2, and now we need to execute this statement. This means we'll get our second white space here. Now let's execute this statement once again. We will get 3 here. Let's execute this statement and we will get our third white space here. Now we will execute this statement. We will get 4 here. After this, we need to execute this statement. This means that we'll get our fourth white space here. Now we got 4 different white spaces here. Now after this, we need to execute this statement for r in range n plus 1. Here we know that n is 0, therefore we will get 1 here, which means that from this range function we will get just one value, which is 0. and this value will be received by variable r. Now here we can say that r is the variable pointing to this object with value 0. Now let's execute this statement, which allows us to calculate the value of NCR. Here we know that n is 0 and r is 0. From this formula, we will get 1, which is pointed by this variable NCR. So we can say that NCR is now pointing to this object with value 1. After this, we need to print NCR and the white space on the screen. So we will get 1 and the white space. After this, we need to execute this statement, which means now we will move to the next line. Now we need to execute this statement. This time, n must point to this object with value 1. Now we need to execute this statement. Here we know that this time range function will return 1, 2 and 3 because rows minus n must be equal to 4. We have rows equal to 5 and n equal to 1, so we'll get 4 here. This is the reason why we will get 1, 2 and 3 from this range function. This means this loop will run 3 times. So let's run this loop 3 times. Now we know in the first iteration, space must point to this object with value 1. After this, we need to execute this statement. This means that we will get our first white space in this row. Now we need to execute this statement. This time, this value will be replaced by 2. Let's execute this statement. We will get another white space here. Now let's execute this statement. We will get 3 here. Let's execute this statement now. We will get our third white space in this row. Now we need to execute this statement. And here this range function will return 2 values, 0 and 1. First, r will receive value 0. This means that r is now pointing to this object with value 0. Now we need to execute this statement. This means that we now need to calculate NCR. This time n is 1 and r is 0. After calculation, we will get 1 here. This means that NCR must point to this object with value 1. Now we need to execute this statement. We will get 1 along with the white space on the screen. After executing this statement, we need to execute this statement once again. This time r must point to this object with value 1. Now we need to execute this statement. This time also NCR must point to object with value 1. Now we need to execute this statement. So we'll get 1 on the screen along with the white space. I hope up to this point everything is clear. Now let's execute this statement. We will now move to the new line. Up to this point we know how this program works. Now I'm going to show the output one by one, and your job is to observe the output, and this is the output that we are getting. I hope this program is now completely clear. Now our job is to execute this code in Visual Studio Code so that we can verify our program. So let's execute this program in Visual Studio Code. I have opened the folder Python work, and within this Python work folder, I have this file Pascal triangle.py. I have opened this file in my editor, and this is the code which we have seen in the presentation. Now let's execute this code. For this we need to open the new terminal. And now we need to type this command Python, then white space, then name of the file followed by .py. So let's type this command. Now let's hit enter. Let's enter the number of rows. Let's say 5. Let's hit enter again. We are getting this output, and that's what we want. Now let's execute this command once again. Python, then space, Pascal triangle.py. Let's hit enter. This time let's enter 10. We will get this triangle on the screen, and you can verify this on your own that we are getting the correct values here. With these outputs, we can say that we have verified our program, and this means that our program is working correctly. Now let's get back to our presentation. So we have verified this program in Visual Studio Code, and we got the correct outputs as well. So now we can say that we are done with this topic, and this means that we are done with this lecture. Okay friends, this is it for now. Thank you for watching this presentation. I will see you in the next one.